what you were discussing, it just made me think how the United States in particular, this whole scenario that's been unfolding, these developments around Russia during the military operation, just feels like the U.S. just uh, exerting this Washington consensus and sort of just exporting the consequences onto Europe,
Yes.
and Europe is bowing down like good puppets and
Yes.
doing exactly what the U.S. wants, but ultimately what will just completely and utterly, and already is, just destroying the economic base of those societies. It is quite astounding to see. And then you have, on the other hand, you have Russia and China just on these opposite trajectories, right? And right as this operation was kicking off, Russia and China published a statement about how firm their friendship is.
Hmm.
What is the significance of that here, right? What is the significance of the Russian military operate in terms of this military operation and this new world order that's emerging? Like, how is this partnership going to lead the way? You've spoken on some aspects, so maybe you could
Yes.
expand on it, because it's so important. Because in the West, here in the U.S. especially, this is seen as a huge threat, and you saw the U.S. Administration, Blinken, all of them saying China needs to hold Russia accountable, right? After the U.S. has been basically militarily encircling China, trying to conduct its own kind of economic warfare, even more, I think, pathetic than how it's handling the Russia situation. But after all of this aggression and hubris and just antagonism, it's the U.S. saying, China, go get your friend over here. Stop with all of this. Like what? So could you explain how the Russia-China partnership really factors into all of this?
Wow, we could go on for hours on this one, Danny. It's been the focus of my work for the past 10 years, at least, if not more. Uh, since the start of the New Silk Roads in 2013, I've been covering the New Silk Roads full time on a weekly basis, including many trips, China, Central Asia, Pakistan, Laos, and in Southeast Asia, and it's it's impossible for an average Westerner, an American, or even a relatively well-informed European here in France or in Germany or in Italy to understand the particularities and the extremely nuanced relationship between Xi Jinping and Putin and the Chinese leadership and the Russian leadership, because this is something they have been developing for years at the highest level, not only between the leaders, but by their Ministry of Foreign Affairs, by their academics, by their research centers, by the interactions between some of their best intellectuals. Uh, of course, there is some resistance on both sides. There is some resistance in some sectors of the Russian intelligence because they fear that Russia would be the minor partner in a relationship with China. And there is some resistance in less, but there is in some Chinese uh, centers of in excellence, let's put it this way, because they might think that Russia might drag them down because Russia is much more powerful in confrontational terms against the US than China really is. At the same time, the Chinese know that they are next, that the focus at the moment by this toxic mix of neocons and neoliberals, humanitarian imperialists disguised as neoliberals, uh, China is next. They are starting with Russia, and the ultimate threat is China. So they take this into consideration as well. Operation Z, the lineaments of what would happen. Of course, Putin and Xi had already discussed between them, and Wang Yi and Lavrov had already discussed between them. Of course, not the exact date where we would stop. Well, it would start. Sorry, but what might happen because the Russians were not getting any response from the Americans when they started, okay, let's have a discussion about
Yeah.
indivisibility of security. And absolutely nothing happened.
Nothing.
And the Russians already knew that nothing would happen. So
Right.
they had to do it because they were already looking at, when you are a good chess player, you're already looking 5 moves ahead. Okay,
Mhm.
so what if they don't do anything? Well, we have a series of scenarios. One of them is we're going to pacify Donbass. The problem is they had to do it the worst possible way, because Russian intelligence found out that the American NATO plan was to instrumentalize the Ukrainian forces based on the border of Donbass to launch a blitzkrieg, which could turn into a genocide.
Mhm.
And this was, they had to have 100% certainty. And they did before the start of Operation Z. The difference were dates. The SVR, Russian Foreign Intel, they had 3 dates. Look, the Blitzkrieg could start end of February, mid-February, end of February, or the first 2 weeks in March. So in the end, Putin decided not to gamble and not to, okay, let's start this as soon as possible. And the mechanism was there because the same information was shared by the Donetsk and Luhansk leadership. They knew it. And that's why they addressed Moscow. Look, can you support us? And can you recognize that we are 2 independent people's republics? And that's what happened. The Kremlin recognized them as 2 independent people's republics. They asked for help because they said, look, we're going to be invaded. And that was the beginning of Operation Z. Of course, none of these technicalities and details is explained to Western audiences. So it's impossible for anybody in the US, Canada, or the whole NATO stand space to put the whole thing in context. Because if you don't know what happened in February, it's impossible to understand why Operation Z is deploying. And if you don't know what happened in Donbass for the past 8 years, even worse,
Yeah.
because this was a Russian reaction to what was going on in Donbass. In my own case, I saw it by myself when I went there in 2015. People living in bunkers and being shelled all the time by Ukrainian forces. But very, very few people in the world knew, outside from Russians, knew about that or know about that. And that's the problem, because the absence of contextualization about everything that is going on leads us to the French called it pensée unique, unique thought, which is it sounds great in French, but not very good in English. So you only think under these terms. Putin is crazy and he launched an illegal invasion. He's killing people. And there's nothing else because there's no context.
He snapped.
And he
Putin snapped.
he's evil and he's snapped. Exactly. So no context. And the context is extremely complicated. First to understand, and immediately after to explain to people who are not familiar with the history of Russia, the history of Ukraine, the history of this whole region, the complexity of the Black Sea, for instance, the question of Crimea, all that. It's very, very complex. And from the point of view of the toxic marriage, neocons, neoliberals, it's very easy. You reduce this to a formula. The new Hitler.